Welcome back to the second unit of the communication part of environmental policy. In this section, I will talk briefly about the history of environmental communication, and that history starts basically already more than a century ago. In the late 19th century, we already see in some countries a rising concern about the decline of nature. In some countries, national parks were created. Yellowstone, for instance, in the United States, is already going back more than 100 and close to 150 years back. But also in other countries, such as the Netherlands, we see around the turn of the 19th or the 20th century, in around 1906, that people from what you might consider the upper class aristocrats in some ways were worried about the decline of nature, and in Holland the Naardermeer near Amsterdam, a pristine lake and wetland area was going to be used by the city of Amsterdam as a landfill, which led to a protest, and it also led to the formation and the foundation of Natuurmonumenten, an NGO to protect nature. And we see also the first efforts to increase awareness among citizens about the importance of nature, the importance of the web of life, about understanding and appreciating the different species around us. A particular example of that at that time, which is one of the first campaigns, you could say, is the Verkade albums. Verkade, a big cookie company still today. They agreed with nature conservationists like Heijmans and Thijssen, to pioneers in nature conservation, to develop a kind of a collection game where if you would buy biscuits in these tin cans at the time, then you would also buy with that a package containing pictures of different landscapes, of different aquatic life forms, of different bird species, and for each of these categories of nature, they would have a book which you could then use to collect these pictures. And this is one of the first major public awareness campaigns around nature conservation, which became very popular. And nowadays we do similar campaigns, but then it's for commercial use only often. But go to the Albert Heijn and you will find, for instance, a collection, similar approaches using soccer players that you need to collect. And kids still do that today. But the initial programs were aimed at increasing awareness, improving ecological literacy. You also saw visitor centers and national parks. You saw awareness campaigns, school garden programs in many cities already more than 100 years ago. Cities like The Hague and Rotterdam started school garden programs, and later city farms to get young children who would never get out of the city to get to experience nature and to interact with animals. So this goes way back already, nature conservation education. Then, and here are some examples of that. Often it's outdoors, it's embodied, it's place-based, it's a discovery, it is understanding different species, recognizing them, but also just being outdoors and developing a sense of place and connecting with the natural world, also through the arts. Then, as we move further in time, and you go to the 1950s and 60s, with the first signals that our environment, our waterways, our soils, the air, is declining, and the quality of water, soil, and air is actually becoming so bad in some places of the world that it's affecting aquatic life and also human health. This is also when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, one of the first books showing how pesticides can accumulate in food chains, and Also the Club of Rome in 1970, 1972, the Man and Human Environment Conference in Stockholm, Club of Rome limits to growth, outlining scenarios where if population growth would continue, then the pressure on natural resources would be tremendous. So this is a time when we see the rise of the environmental movement, but also of environmental science, of environmental studies, and indeed environmental education and communication. And it's not so much about connecting people with nature and getting to understand the natural world and appreciate it, but much more focusing on raising environmental awareness and changing environmental behavior. How do we get people to participate in separating waste, in recycling, in using less energy? Those were the kinds of questions, and how can we develop a support base in society for environmental legislation? How do we make sure that people appreciate legislation and guidelines to improve quality of the environment? That also requires some literacy, environmental literacy. Otherwise, people would not vote for parties that would emphasize the importance of this. So it's also about creating a support base in society. So you see environmental education centers in cities, you see public awareness campaigns, schools are beginning to engage with topics like acid rain at the time was a big issue. But also other forms of air pollution and water pollution. Lots of units on monitoring water quality, also for school children. And some of you may have experienced this in your own high school years or even primary school years. Some examples of that you can see here. The water quality monitoring networks of schools monitoring watersheds and rivers. In the middle you see an environmental awareness campaign about plastic recycling and separating plastics, the Plastic Heroes campaign, so about 10 years ago I think. And on the right an educational project where young people go to grocery stores and they get a challenge with the same amount of money. Different groups get to buy what's on the shopping list, but one group is challenged to buy it with the least possible packaging, not paying attention to price, and the other group buys it the cheapest way possible. And then in the end, they unpack everything and they compare the amount of packaging that is being used in products to raise awareness about packaging and waste, and also understand the kind of packaging that's being used. So this is between the 1970s and still today quite prominent in our education but also in our public awareness campaigns. So the emphasis is on environmental awareness and behavioral change. And if we move on to say the early 90s, when we have the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, then we begin to realize that many of the problems that we are facing are not just environmental or ecological. They also have to do with the social, cultural, and economic aspect. It has to do with inequity, inequality, distribution of wealth. But another realization is that it's a very systemic, systems-related problem that the magnitude of which is so enormous, the scale of which is so enormous that it's not easily contained in a watershed, a river, or in a local community. It is affecting global systems. The planetary boundaries mentioned in the last unit are being exceeded. And here's an example of the plastic islands, the plastic soups, the gyres that are forming in the oceans where plastics concentrate, as an example of that. But of course, climate change is another example. It's not just about environment and ecology, it's also about the social impact and social relations and the economy, the way the economy works. So it is far more complex and even wicked, where we need to understand these issues from a more integral, holistic point of view, a systems point of view, which requires really a transition of our lifestyles, of our values, the principles that are underneath the systems that are in a way forcing us to live unsustainable lifestyles, making that easy, while living sustainable lifestyles is in a way made hard. So we need to think more systemically, more holistically, and we need to think about transitioning towards an alternative way of living, where we can live, to use Kate Raworth's words again, live within the donut, having a healthy, solid social foundation while remaining within ecological boundaries. So we see that we get now new forms of learning, social learning, more participatory approaches, a multi-stakeholder dialogue, where different groups that have different ideas and perspectives need to kind of understand each other's way of viewing the world, need to have the capacity to put their minds in the minds of others, need to develop empathy, and need to be able to trust and listen to each other, but also need to co-create and co-design alternative forms of living in cities, connecting with the rural, bearing in mind not just the local but also the global. So now we enter the era of sustainability and sustainable development. So sustainability and sustainability education and communication includes also the ecological literacy and the environmental awareness and the behavioral change, but it adds a whole new layer of also being mindful of social inequity, of the way the economy works, and how we need to co-create more sustainable ways of living that include a rethinking of our values and the mechanisms that kind of drive the way we live. So the intended impact, you might say, is a more holistic or more integrated approach of dealing with issues around water, food, energy, poverty, and biodiversity in governance, in education, and in business. And these examples include multi-stakeholder platforms focusing on sustainable development and the SDGs, whole school approaches to sustainability, but also in the corporate world, corporate social responsibility. In our education system, there are also examples of this more integrative approach. The eco schools are an example where schools look at energy, they look at waste, they look at biodiversity around school grounds, they look at minimizing their ecological footprints, but also changing and adapting, reforming the curriculum to include topics like cradle to cradle, biomimicry, regeneration, and so on. Dissecting cell phones to see what's in it, where does it come from, how does it affect our lives, how does it affect the lives of others, can we redesign a phone and make it a really smartphone that is also environmentally sound but is also fair in terms of how they are produced, and so forth and so on. And on the right, you see the example of what you might call citizen science, of people monitoring their own environment and trying to influence their own environment in a positive way. And here's some more examples of that. So, to wrap this brief history, to wrap it up briefly, education and communication has been used for a long time in influencing people's knowledge and understanding and their awareness and values and competencies to allow for a more sustainable way of living. It started with nature conservation education already a long time ago. It went on in the 1960s, 70s with environmental education, environmental communication, looking to change environmental behaviors, specifically targeting energy, water, waste, and then moving to where we are today to sustainability, communication and education, and SDG 4 quality and 17 quality education, developing partnerships, multi-stakeholder approaches, where it's more than just behavior, it's really changing lifestyles and changing communities in rethinking the values that they live by and connecting action to social change and ecological, socio-ecological restoration, regeneration. And we see a lot of transition movements at the moment where communities are trying to become more independent, self-determined, autonomous in how they generate energy, how they have more localized food systems. So you can see today that a lot of communication and governance and education is about engaging people meaningfully in determining a more sustainable lifestyle. So co-creation and multi-stakeholder learning is very important in this. So that's it for the second unit of the first session. And you may have some questions. Again, there should be opportunities to post them in the virtual classroom, or you can always just email at arjen.wals@ver.nl and I will respond as good as I can.